Hello and welcome to Horse Race Politics. My name is Dr. Matthew Wall. I'm a political scientist at Swansea University, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
Hello, my name's Dr. Elena Kilby, and I'm a lecturer in journalism in the Department of Media and Communication at Swansea University.
And I'm Dr. Richard Thomas, a senior lecturer in the same department.
So we're all academics specialised in the study of campaigns and political communication.
And we've created this podcast to share our analysis of the 2020 US presidential election campaign in real time as it unfolds, using information from political gambling markets to keep score.
Unfortunately, this is the last episode of the series, and we hope you found them useful and that they've helped you to navigate through what is a huge unfolding political story.
So this is, as Richard said, the last episode of the series, and we're going to use it, as you might expect, to reflect back on a chaotic election night. With the votes still being counted as we record, we reflect on how the markets are seeing things right now and look at how the results that we have seen unfolded in real time across the media. We look at both the results themselves as well as how candidates have presented them to the public in what looks likely to be an acrimonious process. And we just end by reflecting really on what all of this means for the media, pollsters and political gamblers. So yeah, Richard, as I said, we don't have a full accounting of the results, but I think it's still possible to draw some strong conclusions based on what we have seen so far. We've certainly seen a lot. So perhaps we could start with your thoughts on the election night.
Sure. I think we're all going to remember the number 270, aren't we? It's going to be burnt into our memories for a long time. The other significant thing about that number, of course, is the average number of days of a human pregnancy. And I think this has all been just as painful as that in many ways, hasn't it? Just waiting for the results to come out. So as I think we all did, stayed up all night watching the results, have been glued to it ever since. And obviously platforms like Twitter and rolling TV news coverage, that helps us to keep in touch with what's going on. I think before we go into the sort of highlights and lowlights, Matt, just wanted to point out that I think we finally rumbled you fairly early on. Fox News reporting that a British gambler, we can only assume that's you, placed the biggest ever election wager in history on Trump, a cool 5 million.
Wow.
I'm not sure that's what all of this funding was meant for, okay? But there we are. It's done now.
Well, hopefully my wife isn't going to listen to the podcast. That could cause some problems.
So I think the early tone of the night was set a bit by the BBC even before the polls closed. So their election news page on their website contained a few short videos. Among them, what was called "That Was Wild: Campaign in 3 Minutes." Another one was called "US Election: What's the Worst That Could Happen?" And they've proved very, very accurate, haven't they? There was an early CNN report that an electional official in Nebraska was warning people to disregard an anonymous robocall telling them to stay safe and stay home. I don't know if you saw that.
There was another one, Richard, saying that they should really get ready to vote and be ready to go, but it gave them the wrong day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Instagram actually told everybody that the election was the day after it actually was.
Excellent.
Independent, who I've noted have been particularly anti-Trump all the way through this in the most sort of visceral of terms. They published an article saying 17 times experts and politicians have terrifyingly compared Trump to a dictator. We had the fake Trump account on Twitter coming out saying, "I'm an idiot, don't vote for me." We had Obama making an intervention with that film where he was actually FaceTiming several people in various parts of the country who were queuing up to vote, huge beaming smiles, urging them, thanking them for going out to vote and giving them the opportunity to tell their stories. Fox, of course, were up to their usual kind of standard election day anti-voting message spray painted on Kansas City World War I Museum. New York Police Department prepared for any post-election mayhem, says top cop. What happens if there's a tie in the electoral college vote? They were asking at 8:30 in the evening, and we're getting close to that, aren't we?
It's remarkably, it's still a possibility, yeah.
Yeah. We had a piece on MSNBC, which was sort of debunking Trump's last-minute appeal to Latino voters, saying, Trump's America has got all of the things that many people fled their countries of origin to kind of avoid. Quite a strong piece there. Then we had at 10 p.m., we had a poll coming out what do US voters care about? It was conducted by Edison Research via Reuters, a sample of 2,413, and conclusively, it's the economy that US voters care about, 34%, racial inequality, 21%, the pandemic, 18%. So we've been calling this the COVID election, haven't we? And I'm not sure that it actually turned out to be a COVID election much, did it?
It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, if you think, during the campaign, not only have 1,000 people approximately been dying every day with this disease, they're setting new records daily now for national infection and numbers. But the president himself obviously contracted and was hospitalized with coronavirus. And as you say, it was the third most important issue. So it does show you something about the limited ability, I suppose, of media coverage to fundamentally alter what it is that people think about when they're voting.
Yeah, we then had people joining in on Twitter showing a sort of montage of screenshots from Fox of some uncomfortable news anchors presenting some very disappointing polling data about Trump. We had Reuters reporting that Deutsche Bank was looking for ways to end its relationship with Trump once the election was over. We had The Independent asking, will Trump be arrested as Biden gets sworn in as president? Interestingly, on the BBC, we had a guy called Brian Lanza, a former advisor to Trump, saying that the Trump team needed lightning to strike twice. And Andrew Neil cut him down quite quickly, saying lightning never strikes twice in the same place. Then we had the first votes coming in. So Trump took an early 11 college vote lead. And then shortly afterwards, BBC connected live to Mary Trump, who delivered an astonishingly savage takedown of her uncle, where if you thought she was holding back before, she definitely didn't hold it back on that occasion. Then we had a slightly distraction where we understood that Kanye West picked up 712 votes in Kentucky. And then we had a couple of people from the BBC saying that in the election coverage generally, there wasn't enough leisure centres being featured. Fox made a lot out of Biden speaking and getting or stumbling over the name of his granddaughter. Of course, that was more apparent evidence of his problems. And then we had another Sean Hannity tweet, which made note of the fact that Joe Biden, for a couple of seconds, was trying to speak to a turned off microphone. Well, if he could only see the things that we've dealt with when we've been doing this podcast, Joe Biden, is nothing, right? But I think what was the thing that I wanted to talk about really was the difference in coverage between CNN and BBC. CNN was astonishing, I think. It's still going on as we speak now.
Yeah.
This kind of blanket wall-to-wall rapid fire delivery. This guy, John King, and his magic board. The stats attack he was giving, it was the pace of it all, the breathlessness of it all.
Yeah.
Whilst BBC, it's almost we're almost like people outside through looking through the glass at people that were happening, and it was almost done through a tone of whimsy. Oh gosh, look what's happening. I wonder what that means. The pace was a lot slower. The pace was a lot more sort of detached, more whimsical, whereas CNN was literally, it was color, it was vivid reds, vivid blues, numbers on the screen all the time. It was an astonishing piece of broadcasting by them, I think, which is, as I say, it's still going on at this point.
If I could just come in there, though, because I had a similar experience. I was, I usually watch CNN for American elections precisely because of John King, or some people are calling him King John after his virtuoso performance. But I was flicking more to BBC, and I was shocked at the low standard of discussion, of engagement with data. Normally in BBC, you have John Curtis reporting on the exit poll and contextualizing a lot of that early data. It was very poor. So I stopped watching BBC. But the other thing I want to say about John King is he didn't just, report and visualize. He contextualized and explained the interpretation in a way that I think anyone could understand. And to do that with that level of complexity is an incredible achievement.
It was an amazing, it throws up these unusual an unlikely stars, doesn't it? But I think he was definitely one. I think the other thing that happened on CNN was their absolute outrage. I mean, absolute outrage when Trump made his sort of premature victory statement. I mean, they were visibly shocked and disgusted, all of the people on that program. They wheeled out a few commentators. They wheeled out a Republican lawyer, Ben Ginsberg, to basically, join in the outrage about all of that. I think what was really interesting at one stage when I was watching, they actually got to a stage where they ran out of news. They said, "We have nothing new to tell you. We've told you everything that we have. So we're going to go to a commercial break and we're going to get on the phones. And we're going to ring Nevada. We're going to find out what's going on." So, and I think that really triggered the fact that since, nothing's been happening, they have literally, to use my phrase from a couple of weeks ago again, been making that 7-course dinner out of a pan of boiling water because they have nothing new to announce. Just to end with one sort of anecdote from this morning, I was watching at 7:30 this morning, and there was a discussion about why it was taking so long to count the votes in Georgia. So what they did, CNN, they went to an interview about 8 minutes long, a live interview with one of the people who was counting the votes. At which stage, of course, I was shouting at the screen saying, "That's why it's taking so long, because you keep taking people out of their jobs and making them talk to you." They then went to a 4-way panel discussion, which spent the first few minutes talking about how good this lady was talking in front of the camera. And the fact, wasn't it wonderful that everybody had given up their civic duty at that stage. And then afterwards, when one of their pundits sort of on the ground was trying to work out some numbers and had a producer working them out on the calculator on her iPhone in the car park outside the count. At that stage, you really realize that there is a sort of, there is a deficit of new information. And when they run out, it's when these people start to look either very professional or very, very amateur. But it was an amazing, amazing experience.
It was incredible. And I think that is a really interesting point, that tension between this incredible rapidity of information in the first 3 or 4 hours. And then the nearly like a gridlock of information thereafter. Elena, as I was watching it, I suppose I was looking for sort of early signs of the polls being more or less right. And Florida would have been a huge kind of bellwether. And, basically, if Biden had won Florida, I think I could have gone to bed pretty safe in the knowledge that the rest of it was going to come through. But obviously, Florida, and I suppose specifically when the Miami-Dade numbers came in, that was sort of the moment where you realize that I'm pretty into statistics, but that's when I thought Florida was done. But you realize this was going to be close. And the sort of narrative of a blue wave that we might have expected to see disintegrated, and the new narrative of a close election started to be shaped. And I wonder what you made of that kind of moment, and what maybe was behind it a little bit.
Yeah, well, this was quite an interesting point that was picked up quite a lot by the late night scene. So, I've talked about during this podcast how, the whole late night scene hasn't really set this election on fire in terms of their analysis. But I think over the last 2 days, they've really brought this back. And to give one example, so Trevor Noah had an hour show that was, following the election, as we all were that evening. And I think that it was actually taken from an election fallout shelter just in case the proverbial hit the fan. But again, there was this usual thing of checking scores like most of the mainstream media and the cable channels. But the kind of firm point that was made with his program, and another that I'll talk to you about, was no matter who wins this election, between 40 and 45% of the population think Trump has been doing a great job. So despite his handling of COVID, fractured race relations, his rejection of science, and his contempt for democracy, people have seen all of this play out and they still want more from him. But maybe it's part of what Richard said with the Edison poll earlier, that it's the economy that's actually very important to people. But I think whatever that result is, so whether it's Biden that wins, it's going to make it incredibly difficult to govern the country if that's the case. So what does that mean? Well, in the US, it's very unlikely we'll see this clear repudiation of Donald Trump's politics for quite a long time. And this is evident in the voting numbers and the protests that we've seen overnight in places like Arizona, where you have people coming out to say, stop counting the votes.
No, they want them to keep counting in Arizona.
Yes, sorry, it was Michigan where they wanted to stop the count. But interestingly, in Phoenix, it was the complete opposite. So this is what it's creating, is this disdain for the whole situation. But Sam B was probably one of the most prepared of the late night hosts, given how 4 years ago they pretty much thought Hillary had it in the bag. So with Sam B, she takes 3 different endings to a show, and obviously went with the undecided tape. And like Trevor Noah, she focused on the absence of the blue wave that the polls predicted for Biden. So again, this topic revolved around how polarized the US is, and will it ever be able to claw back some resemblance of bipartisanship and compromise when a large section of the US public still support Trump, despite the issues such as the pandemic and human rights abuses at the border. These are all fair points, but I think we also have to bear in mind the liberal agenda that these shows, in terms of what they put out there, and they're not taking additional variables into account. So we've talked about Latino support for Trump, and this year in particular helped him secure victories in 2 major states. Now, this is strange if we think back to the 2016 campaign where Trump described Mexican immigrants as drug traffickers and rapists. But Trump's Latino support is tied to a number of other different things, such as faith and his pro-life stance. And then we have the other. So we've got Cubans who showed up for Trump because they appreciated this anti-communist stance that was pushed hard in a lot of the political advertising in Miami.
The communist, huh?
Yeah. But, they were talking about... How
effective was that advertising?
But this is the thing, though. I mean, they were talking about this on CNN. I think it was Don Lemon was talking about this, and he was speaking to a lady from Miami. But no matter how untrue it is, it kind of feeds into people's understanding of it and possibly voted for that particular reason. But I think going back to something that we talked about last week, and I think this is something that's absent from satire and from the mainstream media, is that a lot of the people that are voting for Trump reject this idea of the smug liberal elite system that thinks it's wiser and much more clever than them. And I think that's why people are gravitating towards Trump, because he isn't part of that establishment. And, to quote like a self-help guide, he's actually showing his true, authentic self, and they like him for that. But just to move on to the last show that I looked at, which is Seth Meyers, who I think has been pretty good throughout this entire election period in his segment called Closer Look. And he was looking at the Trump press conference where he essentially tried to steal the election with his false declaration of victory. And I think what was interesting about this speech is I think we were all really tired at this point. We'd all been up pretty much all through the night, and it all seemed to be going fairly well. It was very vanilla. And then he dropped that comment, and also about the counting of votes and how that is seen to be fraudulent in his eyes. And again, it's literally the opposite of that. In fact, it's just part of the democratic process. So this and those threats around the Supreme Court to block the counting of vote just pretty much reeked of Trump being a sore loser. And there have been plenty of memes about that today. So Trump as Karen wanted to speak to the polling manager. Yeah, they are funny. Nice. But if we take what Trump says at face value, what we saw was a man that was, in the words of CNN, attempting to earn the election illegitimately, and while at the same time fanning these flames in an already highly flammable situation.
Yeah, I mean, what I enjoyed was his claiming of Michigan, among other states, via Twitter, right? Via the Twitter fiat. So a lot of the memes I saw were, I'm claiming a promotion at work. I hereby claim, I mean, and another one I saw was...
It's what CNN described as 17th century language being used on Twitter. Yeah.
It sounded kind of authoritative. Another one I saw was Trump as a kind of a toddler being pulled out of daycare,
Yeah.
He just didn't want to leave. Yeah, and so, I suppose in terms of the way the betting markets have looked at it, it's been really interesting. Obviously, as we said, it was pretty flat at a sort of a 65-35, really the last 9 or 10 days of the campaign. And all of that changed and nearly, I have a bet on Joe Biden, that I've been sweated more than I'd wanted to for it. But, nearly in that moment when that Miami-Dade number came in, it started shifting, and Trump was a strong favorite maybe about 2.5 hours into the counting. But then we saw this kind of, we started to perceive this effect that as the postal votes came in later in the count, that they were much more favorable, apart from in Arizona, to Joe Biden. At the time of recording now, Donald Trump's about 15 to 20% likely, with Joe Biden 80 to 85% likely on the betting markets. But as Richard said, we've sort of seen a more or less a collapse of new news, and everyone's waiting. Everyone's all of a sudden an expert on the suburbs of Arizona, on the geography of Pennsylvania, right? And we're just waiting for these numbers to come out.
And the big sort of emphasis on the coverage at the moment is pathways. Who's got the pathway? And it's basically talking about all of the same stuff, but using a different way of sort of framing it, isn't it? We're basically waiting for 4 states to announce. And,
but when the moment that pathway discussion changed, and when Biden's odds went way in, when he became much more favored, was Wisconsin and then Michigan, which opened up so many more pathways for Joe Biden to win in the outstanding states than Donald Trump has left. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's basically what the markets have made of it. I think just a funny part, I suppose, about the U.S. elections is I'd kind of forgot that exit poll means a different thing over stateside. So, when you're trying to process all the information and they're like, oh, the exit poll's in from, I think it was Florida. I was like, well, this will tell me if I'm right or not. And then it's some heap of crap about like what their most, what their favorite color of ice cream is. It's like, tell me the voting numbers. Where's John Curtis? Like, just tell me what happened. Yeah. And to be fair, those data do tell you quite a lot about, kind of going back to what Elena said about the composition of the vote. But I just forgot that Americans' exit polls are not predictive in the same way as British ones. Which kind of brings us on, I suppose, Richard, to this question of prediction and media that's been sort of at the heart of what we've been talking about across the podcast. Yeah, I mean, I wonder what you make of it. Who's up and who's down as we look at these, still incomplete figures.
Yeah, well, I think the big thing, and it's very appropriate to the podcast name, isn't it? We've called it horse race politics, and here we are, ironically, without a winner in the horse race. But I think when you've got a president with apparently a 60% disapproval rate of how he's handled the pandemic, he's still there, isn't he? He's still not out of the race. It's not about COVID, but I think more than anything, it's not been about the polls, has it? Every week we've come on here and we've talked about the consistency of all of the pollsters saying pretty much Biden was 10 points ahead. And we're faced with this nail-biting conclusion to all of this, where, CNN are now talking about 5,000 or 6,000 votes in some places that are going to kind of make a decision. I mean, that's not a 10-point lead, is it? So I think, to reflect on our title, that was a sort of stroke of genius on your part, Matt, to call it horse race.
Not the first politics.
One, man. No, first one. Well, your £5 million bet didn't come in yet, did it? Mind. Was to expand on that analogy. This election for me has been another reminder that, as well as the horse race, we should be talking more about the race course, the stables that the horses came from, the way they were trained, the way they were fed, the commentary of the people who were calling the race, and more to the point, I think, talking about the bookies on the side of the track. Because although perhaps the bookies haven't got this absolutely spot on either, they were calling it a much closer race, I think, as you reported last week, than the pollsters were. Opinion polls, they're the obsession, aren't they? They feed the 24 news cycle, but they've just been wrong too many times. They've been wrong too many times in the UK. They've been wrong the last twice, even if Biden ends up winning. He's won it by a whisker rather than a wide margin by, 40 lengths that they said he was going to win by. I mean, the stuff that you were talking about last week, Matt, about people trolling the polls, people being embarrassed to say that they voted for Trump, maybe all of those things were right. But I think whether you like him or loathe him, you have to hand something to Donald Trump, which is even when the sort of all of the media was against him, he's managed to put in this performance.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, even on CNN, I mean, when you're having this kind of thing said about a president, whether it's justified or not, somebody on CNN said Trump wore the Republican Party like a rented tuxedo. Now they face the dry cleaning bill and it's stained with cigarette butts and bodily fluids. Okay.
God.
When you've got that kind of stuff being said about a president and he still manages to pull in pretty well 50% of the vote, whether you like him or loathe him, you have to hand that he's able to deliver something that lots of people seem to want to buy into. But I think that generally, you know, this is a point in time where we have to think about different ways of predicting big elections like this. I don't know what your take on that is, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking about it quite a lot. So in terms of the failure of the polls, it's one of these things to where certainly like the state level polling in some cases has been abysmal, right? So, you know, if you look at, say, Wisconsin or Florida or Pennsylvania, you know, say Wisconsin like was projected like 10, 11 plus points, you know, as high as 17 points plus in one poll I saw for Joe Biden. And it came down to a much finer margin. Similarly, Florida, you know, Biden polled slightly ahead. He lost significantly. At the national level, as the votes continue to trickle in, it's not such an egregious story. And I think that really leads me to think, well, this is why you do need alternative methods of understanding the process of a campaign woven in more. I mean, it's so simple to turn betting odds into probabilities. And what you saw in the betting odds was they sort of handicapped to use another horse racing analogy, they sort of handicapped the polling lead, right? To where going into that interpretation is basically an assumption that the polls are going to be biased against Donald Trump. You know, because we saw anything that worked in a more pure way with polls was up at like 90 to 95% probability. And you just cannot say, looking at it now, that it was a 95% likely win for Joe Biden, even though I think he's still more likely to win where we are right now.
Yeah,
it's finer margins. And so, you know, it does come in, bring it into focus that you need nearly just like if you're trying to measure anything, you know, if you're trying to measure how hot it is, it helps to have 2 or 3 different instruments, you know. In terms of why the polls missed it, I mean, it'll take a while to figure it out. It seems to me as much as anything about coverage, they're not reaching the Trump voters in the first place, or they're reaching them and they're not responding. As I said, I'm surprised that they didn't manage to sort of wait that out in their analysis, because fundamentally, like, unless you're doing a census, you can't force people to take part in an exercise like polling.
We said last week, didn't I? I think I highlighted a piece somewhere. I forget where it's from, but they said, you know, the kind of methodology of the polls is all wrong. The sampling wasn't, as you say, wasn't representative. It was targeting all the wrong kind of people who are going to give a singular worldview and not capturing the other worldview. But I think the key element to me all along with polling, Matt, and it's something, and bookies, you mentioned to me right when we first started talking ages ago about this whole thing, was the bookies have got something tangible to lose if they get it wrong. Haven't they?
And the punters, yeah.
And the punters have too. And so they have a much deeper vested interest in getting this stuff right. I think if the pollsters get it wrong, they could just sort of, you know, a bit like that Homer Simpson meme where you just kind of walk backwards into the bush and everybody forgets about you until the next election. But I think what we could see, I think, in TV coverage on this rolling CNN type coverage in future would be, instead of the polls, what are the bookies saying? What are the markets saying?
Yeah,
you know, let's get that data.
And especially when they're saying something different.
Yeah,
I mean, that's why we put this podcast together, is to use that kind of information. But it's amazing that it was so absent from general consideration.
Interestingly, I think that was covered. I've noticed, looking at news coverage of the betting markets the last couple of days, the likes of The Independent and a few news organisations have started to pick that up in their news coverage.
Yeah, and I think it will become more prominent, and hopefully we'll be able to come together again, because we have sort of run out of time. Just before I close, I would like to say a special word of thanks to Stephen Cleary of Carnival Content, who's been doing sterling work to kind of, I guess, herd the cats of this podcast. Academics and technology don't always go well together. So thanks very much, Steve, and obviously to our sponsors, the Cherish Digital Economy Centre, who made this entire thing possible. So that's it. We leave you with the election still poised. Unfortunately, we thought this would be a results show, but it turns out we're not quite there yet. So everybody stay safe, get some sleep, and thanks very much for listening.